Well, hello, my name is Ted Gardner, and I'm an interviewer for the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. And I'm interviewing Edwin Jung.
It's like Jung with a K.
Jung with a K. I love that. That's
Right.
very, very good.
It's
Yeah.
German.
Okay, and it's the 28th of November, 2006, and we're here at the Wyoming Library, Branch Library, which is a wonderful place. And Diane Reif is our technician here, and she's very gracious and been very helpful. And of course, the present is your wife, Marilyn. Marilyn. That's very important, and it's wonderful. Ed, where were you born?
Born in Hartford, Connecticut.
Hartford. Oh my goodness. That's an old city, isn't it?
Well, I'm going to tell you how old it is. My high school was founded in 1636.
My goodness. That's the year that Harvard University was founded.
It's the second oldest in the country. There was a Boston Latin, I think, in early 1630s.
What was the name of the school?
In Boston?
No, in Hartford.
Hartford High School.
Hartford High School.
Right.
How about that? Well, now is Storrs a suburb of Hartford?
It's about 30 miles east of Hartford, out in the country.
Out in the country.
It was an agricultural college
Yeah.
just before I went there. It became
Okay.
a university. 2,000 students. There's 40,000 today.
Yeah, right. How things change. Well, going back to your childhood, Ed, did you have siblings, brothers and sisters?
Two sisters, right.
Two sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And you went to elementary school there,
Right,
and then on into Hartford High.
that's it.
How about that? How large a high school was Hartford?
We had about 700 in our graduating class. Pretty good
Oh,
size.
That's a good size, I should
Yeah.
say. I should say. Well, and you were born in...
Born in Hartford.
You were born what year? 1923?
23, right.
Okay. All right. Well,
Makes me 83.
I got 2 more years on you. But anyway, it's always interesting to me, at least, and I think to the people who will see this from time to time, and your family and everyone. Everyone likes to know where you came from, where you went to school. Did you have any outstanding experiences before you got into the Army that you remember?
Well, nothing that outstanding.
Just normal growing up and
Well, as you know, growing up in the Depression.
yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was...
I guess the thing that's hard for people today to realize is that we lived in the city and never owned an automobile.
Mm-hmm.
I flew in a B-17 bomber before I got behind the wheel of a car.
How about
And I was just a passenger.
You're right.
I was just hitching a ride.
Sure. I know. That is surprising to younger people today, particularly. Well, so then, in 1942, you were at Connecticut U.
Yeah, I went to Connecticut U in September of '41.
Mm-hmm.
Pearl Harbor was in December, and then things changed a lot.
Oh, that's right.
Immediately, people started leaving for the Army, and
Right.
a year later, I joined the reserves, and then in the following June '43 is when I was called active duty.
What were you studying at Connecticut?
Engineering.
Engineering.
And I did mention in there that in the summer of '42, I worked at Colt's Firearms making guns for the Army
Right.
7 nights a week all summer,
How about
and
that?
that paid for my second year of college.
Sure. So you were 19 years old when you were
19
called
when
to
I
duty.
went in, right, when active duty. right.
Active duty, and that in itself was an experience, wasn't it? Just being called up and rooted out from familiar surroundings and
Well, it was pretty much expected that they let us finish the year. The thing about this Reserve Corps that I was in, the idea was that they thought it was going to be a long war.
Mhm.
As you know, being in the Pacific, they thought it was going to go on for another 2 or 3 years.
Oh, yeah.
And so they wanted to train engineers, so they said, sign up for the enlisted reserve. We'll call you up and give you an accelerated engineering course. So what they did is they sent us to basic training in Texas, and then I got sent to Purdue University for this engineering course.
That's pretty good duty.
It was pretty good duty. It lasted 3 months. And then they decided, well, we don't have time to do that, so we're going to send you back and give you further training on active duty. So from there, I was sent to Fort Leonard Wood. I had taken infantry basic in Texas,
Mhm.
3 months in school, back to Fort Leonard Wood to take combat engineering,
Oh, yes. That was in Kansas, wasn't it?
Missouri.
Oh, Missouri.
Right. And this is the fate of the draw, as you know, having been in that. My roommate and I separated. A year later, he was in Europe, a prisoner of war,
My goodness.
and I was a topographic draftsman,
Uh-huh.
pretty much a desk job.
Uh-huh.
Exactly the same training, exactly the same age, went to the same school, were roommates.
Isn't that amazing?
Just, these things happen.
Well.
If you were lucky, you went one
Yep.
way. If you were unlucky, you went the
Yeah.
other.
It's the luck of the draw, so to speak.
So I took the combat engineering, and then they called me in and said, would you like to be a map maker?
Uh-huh.
I said, that sounds good to me. So
Well-
from there, they sent me to Fort Belvoir outside of Washington, D.C.,
Right, Virginia, right.
where I learned to be a map maker.
Well, now tell us about that map making. That's always fascinated me. I love geography and maps and atlases and things. Of course, you were doing military maps, right?
Right, at that time. Well, basically, the unit I finally ended up with was stationed in Portland, Oregon.
My hometown.
Are you from Portland?
Yeah, Hillsboro, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
My wife's from Portland, and I'm from Hillsboro.
Do you know very much about Portland?
Oh, yeah, I lived the first 31 years of my life there.
Talk about a coincidence. Well, you may well have gone by our basic. The unit I was in was an old line Army unit. Had been in there for years. They had been mapping the West Coast and Alaska,
Yeah,
and they were stationed about a mile south of downtown Portland, overlooking the Willamette River.
Willamette River, yeah.
And,
On the west side or on the east side?
On the west side,
Yeah,
overlooking the river, in a big old schoolhouse.
okay.
And they had a number of barracks, and we had
Uh-huh.
about 500 of us there. Some of these people had been in Alaska, some of them had been other places up and down the coast. And some of these people were, in fact, most of them were old-time regular Army people.
Well, they were,
And
yeah.
then they brought in a few guys like me to kind of fill out the group.
Sure.
So
What was the, let's see, is that in here?
29th Engineers.
29th Engineers, and you were in Portland. That is truly amazing.
Isn't that something?
I have a friend here in town by the name of Harry Whitaker,
Uh-huh.
who was in the same, I don't know if he was in exactly the same outfit, but he's Cincinnati born, which I'm not.
Yeah.
But we've become friends over the last 50 years that we've lived here.
Mhm.
And he was sent to Portland to study map making or map
Really?
designing and so forth. Now, I don't know if he was in the 29th Engineers or not,
Well,
but he was also sent to the Philippines.
I'll have to meet this fella.
Well, I'll certainly make an arrangement for that, because he's a very interesting guy and has been a very successful businessman, and
Is that?
but he's native born Cincinnati,
No kidding.
which you and I are not.
Right.
Well, I'm making a note on that.
Yes.
I'm going to contact him.
Yeah.
Because I remember he told me that he lived on North Tillamook Street on the east side
On the east side.
when he was out there in the Army.
Uh,
So he might not have been in the same unit that
Might
you
be a
were.
different unit.
But anyway, that's
Yeah, I'd
interesting.
like to talk to him.
Well, that would be wonderful. I'll bet you like the Northwest.
You know, I was from Connecticut, but if my family hadn't been in Connecticut, I would have stayed there. I really liked Washington and Oregon.
Beautiful, beautiful country.
Beautiful.
I miss it every day of my life.
Yeah, well, we traveled out there about 10 years ago, and we went by the spot where I was. It's gone now.
Yeah,
And, but I located the street and the block that was on.
isn't that amazing?
And, yes,
Portland's a beautiful city.
right,
I
right.
mean, it's so unusual, and people back here, personal aside, we came here, my wife and I came to Cincinnati in 1955,
Mhm.
and business. But one of the first things that people would say to us here, when they found out that we were from Oregon, and there were two things that they would say. One would be, oh, you know, is Oregon on top, or is Washington on top?
Yeah.
That was a question. And then the other thing was, oh yes, we've been to the West Coast. And then I'd lighten up and I'd say, did you get to Oregon? No, we were in Los Angeles. Well, Ed, it's just, this is such fun, and this happens to me frequently with meeting wonderful people like you. But how long were you there in Portland then?
We got there in September of '44, and we left for overseas in June of '45.
Oh, I see.
And what they would do is they would take aerial photographs of Japan and the various
Right,
Japanese islands. They would fly them to the United States, and then we would make maps from these photographs.
right.
And they had a technique then, it was probably old-fashioned today, but they would take a stereoscopic photograph, two photographs, probably from either end of the airplane wing. And so they would bring these duplicate photographs in. They would put them on a table, a wide table, and they would put on glasses. Have you ever seen one of these 3D movies
Yeah.
where you wear the glasses? That's an old technique.
Yes.
I don't imagine they would use that today, but anyway, one would be red and one would be blue or green, I forget. And they would project each of these images in that same color, and you would see a mountain. Maybe you would have a table about 5 feet wide, and you would see this mountain go up about 3 feet,
Mm-hmm.
just like you were looking at a three-dimensional.
Right.
And then they would locate the various contour lines, like the mountain is 5,000 feet high and it's sea level here. And so they could just follow that with their mobile pen around the curvature of the mountain and draw these contour lines.
Right.
And that was probably the hardest part of that.
Wonderful science, though.
And then I didn't do that. I was a rookie, you know. And then when they got through with that, they'd bring it to the drafting department, and I would ink in the roads and the schoolhouses and
Sure.
things like that.
Well, now when you were flying,
Those were rides that I hitchhiked. That's the only time I ever flew.
oh, I see. Oh,
Yeah,
oh.
no, they would fly in these.
So you were on the ground, and
Oh,
they'd
yeah,
bring it back
right.
to you.
Right.
I see.
Yeah, they would bring these
I see.
from the war zone. And,
Sure, sure. Where in the Philippines were you stationed there?
in Manila.
In Manila,
Right,
capital city,
right.
beautiful city at one time.
Mhm.
And how long were you there now?
We got there in, we left the States early July 45, getting pretty close to the end of the war, but
Yeah.
when we shipped out, the phrase was the Golden Gate in 48, we'll be back in 3 years.
Right.
You know how it was over
Oh
there.
yeah, I remember that.
We had no idea about the atomic bomb or
No.
anything. We expected to be gone a long time. We got there in late July. They dropped the bomb in the middle of August,
Right?
and the war was over September 1st.
Right, right. So did you,
And we stayed on. I didn't have enough points to get
That's what I
home
wondered
early,
about.
so I stayed on until March of
46?
46. And incidentally, the unit stayed on for a number of years
Oh,
and eventually was moved back to Hawaii.
oh,
And I didn't find that out until recently. I would have liked to have gone out and,
I know.
and seen it, but, so
Yeah.
it's still an existing regular Army unit.
What do you know
Today.
about that?
Right.
Well, yeah, and it would have been nice to have some duty on Hawaii too.
Yeah, right.
Beautiful place.
Yeah, I was hoping we'd stop on the way over. We were 22 days crossing the Pacific.
On a big transport?
Not very big, no. It was a victory, I think they call it victory ship.
Victory ship,
Right.
okay.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
We had a lot of equipment. I was looking it up the other day. We had 100 tons of equipment. They brought over printing presses, all kinds of photography equipment, all kinds of drafting equipment. The local engineers built us a cement block house, or not house, but building, with air conditioning. We had the only air-conditioned building in Manila, I think, because when you run printing presses, they have to be precisely
Oh, yes,
controlled.
I should say.
Now, I hasten to say that was all right when you were working, but we were living in tents, and I've got some pictures of it.
Oh, yeah,
The rest of the time.
I'll hold these up, and let me see some of
if I
those
can-
tent pictures, because people would be interested in seeing this. I'll hold this up for Diane so
I
that
don't know if you can,
she can zero in on it here, but here's an idea. It looks almost like a circus tent there, doesn't it? Are you in this picture here?
well, let me see if I'm in it.
Are you in that?
Okay, that's me right there.
That is you right there. Look at that young, virile.
I was
Good-looking
21,
guy.
21, looked about 17.
Oh, that is truly interesting.
Couple more.
Yeah, let's show those so people can get an idea. And yeah, you know, and being in close quarters with other fellas like that, that was one thing I had to learn about. Although I'd had some, I'd been in college for a couple of years when I finally got into the Navy, and I'd had some experience living with fellas in close quarters, but there's nothing like being in an Army tent camp or being aboard a ship where the quarters are pretty confined, and you learn to get along.
Learn to get along.
You sure did.
Learn to get along.
Sure did. What else do you have to show us there, Ed?
It turned out that Manila, MacArthur retook Manila in the spring of 45. And Manila, I think I'm correct here, Manila was the most heavily bombed city in World War II. It was a city of, I think, close to 1 million people, and it was completely destroyed. The Japanese refused to surrender. When MacArthur knew that he couldn't defeat the Japanese, he declared it an open city and retreated to Corregidor, the island out on the bay.
Right.
And so nothing was disturbed, but the Japanese would not give in. They were going to fight to the last man, and they did.
Yeah.
And so it was just
Oh, it was just
destroyed. Here's a couple of pictures
just terrible, and it was heartbreaking to think about it, because it's such a beautiful city.
of what it looked like.
Yes, the old church and the downtown buildings and so forth. Complete destruction.
Complete destruction.
And this was one of the things that a lot of people today don't understand about the enemy. And the enemy was so determined to die for the emperor. So to
Right.
speak.
Right.
They weren't going to give up, and they had that mindset. And you know, we, in this part of the world and in Europe, Western Europe, so-called West, had more compassion for things like
Mhm.
churches and government buildings and residences and so forth. Yeah, it's well, that, of course, speeding on, and I expected to be sent back out into the Western Pacific
Right.
in August of
Mhm.
45. Fortunately, that I didn't have to do that. So then you stayed on in the Philippines until
Until March of...
March of 46. Yeah. Well, what were you doing all that time?
Well, we
after
were
the-
still working. We started mapping the Philippines then.
Oh, I see.
And they stayed on and did that.
The islands. Did you get to travel to some of the islands?
I traveled just around Luzon. I went over to the peninsula where MacArthur made his last stand.
Yeah,
Where
Bataan.
the Bataan Death March was occurring.
Right.
And which brings up the case of General Yamashita. When we were in Manila, just before the war ended, he had left a group of maybe 20, 30,000 to defend Manila, and they just all fought to the death. I don't think that they might have been the 20 or 30 of them surrendered.
Handful of
Everybody else, and they just went on a murderous rampage. They were killing and raping and
Yes.
not just soldiers, but women and children.
Oh, yes.
It was terrible. But Yamashita, who was the head general there, he had over 100,000 troops up on the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And his idea was, it's lost as far as I'm concerned, but if I can tie up enough Americans here, it'll delay them going on to Japan.
Right.
And so he was there when we were still up there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a good time to mention something that I put in my letter there.
Right.
And people in this area may or may not know that it was a local young farm boy who was the last American killed in World War II.
Hmm.
It was in the paper here a few years ago. But he was up in the mountains about 150 miles north of where we were stationed. And they had the Japanese surrounded, but there were thousands of them, and he was in a trench on the morning of the armistice, half hour before the armistice, stuck his head out of a foxhole and got killed.
Oh.
Out of the hundreds of thousands of killed and wounded, this local boy was the last American
Isn't that
in
something?
World War II.
I know. Just.
And there's just a small memorial up here, and I mentioned the town
Mm-hmm.
in there. I forget just which one it is.
Yeah.
At the end of that letter that I did.
Right, right. Right. Well, the Private Edward Odell Mullins from Morrow, Ohio,
Yeah,
was shot and killed. And isn't that, oh, now I recall that story.
I saw that in the paper when we were visiting here a few years ago, and I clipped that out. In fact, I called the reporter to get a little more information
Well, I should
on where
say,
he was.
well, that was, I know, there's so many ironies, you know, of war and everything, and I just, I had friends who had amazing experiences in surviving and so forth.
So 2 weeks later then, MacArthur, they dropped the bomb, or actually on that day they surrendered after the bomb.
Right.
And 2 weeks later, in early September, then MacArthur went to Tokyo, and they had the famous surrender in Tokyo Harbor.
Tokyo Harbor.
And when that took place, the General Yamashita, who, as I say, still had over 100,000 troops up in the mountains, unlike a lot of the Japanese, decided that he would not commit harikiri, but he would come down and surrender his troops. And MacArthur, from Tokyo, ordered an immediate military trial to be held in Manila. And within a month, they put him on trial in Manila.
Mm-hmm.
And our outfit had a very small part to play in that we photographed some of the evidence that was used in that trial. And I have some pictures that our fellows took of the trial.
Oh, good. We'd like to see those too. Yeah.
So those pictures
Oh,
are,
yes.
are over 50 years old.
Yes, well, they're beautifully preserved, Ed, and those are very, very, did you take these pictures by any
No,
chance?
I didn't. As I say, we had photographers.
Yeah, right.
Um,
Yeah, there's Yamashita right there
There he is.
on trial, and his interpreters, and, oh my goodness. Well, now, he was hanged, wasn't he?
He was hanged. And this is a good time to bring up something that relates to what's going on today. I was listening to C-SPAN a couple of weeks ago, and they talked about the Yamashita trial.
Hmm,
And what it was is how much, well, two things. First, how responsible is a military general for something that happens hundreds of miles from where he was?
right.
Because he was up in the mountains, he had no control over these forces down in Manila, but still, he was hung for it.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing that came up is, when does the Army have jurisdiction, and when does a person deserve a civilian trial? Like today, we have these terrorists in Guantanamo Bay.
Right.
The Army wants to try them. They say the war isn't over, so we can try them. But they also say the war will never be over.
Mhm.
And there's many people that say, no, they should get a civilian trial. And I don't think that the Supreme Court has ruled on that yet.
I think you're right, and this is very interesting because what you bring up, last November the 11th, which is Veterans Day, as you know, our main library downtown, at the corner of 8th and Vine, which is a wonderful place, has for the last 52 years had a big Veterans Day ceremony there, because that library is a memorial to the Hamilton County veterans. This year, a man by the name of John Dolebois was the speaker, and he was an interrogator at the Nuremberg trials
Really?
at the end of World War II in Germany. And of course, he's had some great experiences. You know, he was face to face with Hermann Goering.
Really?
The day before Goering took the
Committed-
poison, you know,
committed
committed
suicide.
suicide. But he pointed out that our intelligence depends so much on what we can extricate from prisoners.
Right,
And by golly, you have to do what you can do
yeah,
to get that information out.
yeah,
And this civilian, I understand civil rights and all that, you know, but civilian interrogation and trials and so forth tend to water down the whole thing, don't they?
I'm sure that was true then, and it's true
yeah.
today, so
But
that's been a controversy for over 50 years.
Oh yes, and that's been, I guess, maybe hundreds of years that it'll be wrangled over.
But it's interesting when I'm listening to C-SPAN, and all of a sudden they say, well, that's a precedent that was started under the Yamashita trial in World War II.
How about that? And you
Yeah.
were there.
I said, yeah, well, I was just there one day as an observer, but
Right,
our fellows had a little small part
sure.
to play in it. I remember one time I was in the photographic section one night. I used to go back to work because it was air conditioned. It was pretty hot out in our tent. And they were photographing some evidence. And what it was somebody that had been on the Bataan Death March and had kept a record on scraps of paper.
Mm-hmm.
There were bits of old tomato can labels and scraps of paper and so on. There was a whole pile of them there. And I read a few of them. You know,
Amazing.
today we did this, and today so-and-so was
Right.
killed, and so-and-so.
Wow.
I don't know if that particular batch got into the trial or not, but they were photographing this.
Well, I think those things were very, very important, and yes, they were used, and used as evidence of what went on. And we all know this story well. I don't know how many people today know the story, but the terrible, terrible deprivation and horrible conditions that the survivors of the Battle of Bataan suffered as they marched north to
Right.
Cabanatuan prison. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
right.
right.
Terrible.
There were still a few. Now, they were liberated, I think, about March or April. And this was July, but there were still a few of them still in the hospital there.
Right.
They were too weak to, most of them had been returned to
Yes.
the States, but there were still a few of them
Right.
still there
Right.
when I was there.
Well, there, of course, as you know, there have been many, many books written about this. And this library here has such a wonderful collection of World War II histories. They're fascinating. So there you were, 19 years old, and almost 10,000 miles from home. Well, 10,000, 3,000
Yeah.
across this country, and another
Yeah.
7,000 across the
Right.
ocean.
Right.
While you were there, did you see any of the action that the Army we had re-entered the Philippines in October of '44?
I went up to Subic Bay where the landing was made,
Oh, you did.
and that was pretty quiet by then.
Right.
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 There was still a big naval presence there. of course.
Yes.
And,
Yeah, we've closed that down recently. That's unbelievable.
and went up to Baguio where Yamashita surrendered up in the mountains.
Right.
See what that's like.
Right. And that was the summer capital
Summer capital,
of the
right, of the
Philippines.
Philippines.
Because it was up in the mountains and it was cooler.
Yeah, it was. I would have liked to have been stationed there. It was, got pretty warm.
I should say. So, this is really fast. Now, what is this here?
Well, let me show you what I got here.
All right. We'll hold it up so
When he
Diane.
surrendered, they had to have an official surrender document.
Uh-huh.
Now, I'm 99% sure on this, so I don't want to be quoted.
Instrument of
But
surrender.
as far as I know, our unit printed the surrender document
Oh,
that Yamashita signed when he surrendered his army in the Philippines.
how about that?
And they made copies for all of us.
Oh, boy, what a souvenir.
So that's my souvenir.
Well, I think I spotted this right away.
Yeah.
Very interesting. His signature on there is in English script. Did you notice
Well-
that? He didn't sign it in Japanese.
Yamashita actually was educated briefly in the United States.
Right,
He
right.
he came over here before, probably back in the 30s. and
Yes.
Went to school up in New England someplace.
Well, Yamamoto, you know, the great Admiral Yamamoto, the same way. He was at Harvard for a while
Is that right?
in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And, they admired American education.
Mm-hmm.
And as a boy growing up on the West Coast, I was well aware of, we had lots of Japanese living up and down
Right.
the coast. And of course, many of them were Nisei, which were
Mhm.
American born. And I had them in my high school, and they were wonderful people. But I can remember a couple of instances where UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles, there were a couple of Japanese Army officer students there. And then they went back and then fought in the war against the men that they were educated with in Los Angeles, you know. So a lot of twists and turns in wartime are so fascinating and interesting. I'm fascinated by your map-making ability and your reading and so forth, and how to do that, and as your engineering training was brought out, and that made you able to see things in different dimensions and
Well, again, as being a non-combatant, I was one of the lucky ones. I mean, you saw action, you know what it was like, and I was pretty much an observer. I went a lot of places. I went back and forth across the United States for, let's see, June, 15 months, crisscrossed it 2 or 3 times.
really,
I was in Texas, basic training, Indiana, Purdue briefly, Missouri for combat engineering, Fort Belvoir outside of Washington, back to Missouri, and then finally to the West Coast, and then out to Manila. So I probably put in 15, 20,000 miles of railroad
oh
back
boy.
and forth across the United States. One of the interesting things, and again, strictly as an observer, not as a participant, being in Washington during wartime, Belvoir was right outside of the city, so we could take the bus in on weekends. We were at school 6 days a week, but we had Sunday off.
Right.
So you could take the bus and go in, and so, of course, you couldn't drive or anything. We used to rent bicycles and drive around. And we'd go by the White House. Of course, Roosevelt was there, but we never saw him. I remember one time when, I don't know if it was Churchill or one of the European leaders was in Washington. And that weekend, there was a big car in front of the White House. I wonder if that's de Gaulle. It was de Gaulle.
Oh, de Gaulle.
Yeah, I wonder if that's de Gaulle there, you know. So again, as a, not as a participant, but as a kind
As
of
an
a
observer.
bystander, you got the flavor of Washington at wartime.
Right, right.
And of course, we had plenty to eat because we were in the Army, but you know, it was kind of tough on rations and so on. for
Oh, I should
civilians.
say. And that's another thing, of course, the rationing, gasoline rationing, you know, and your parents had a car, maybe they had an A sticker.
Mhm.
If they were lucky, they got a B sticker, which
Right.
gave them a little more gasoline rationing. Well, your experiences in traveling across the country are fascinating to me because I'm a train buff anyway, and I've done a lot of train travel through my life.
Have you taken the Great Northern?
Oh, yes. Great Northern and Northern Pacific, CB&Q, all that stuff. You know,
We
Union
went-
Pacific.
as I say, I got 2 furloughs, so you'd go to Seattle and get on the Great Northern at Sunday night. You get off on the East Coast the Thursday morning. Well, you go to Chicago and then take
Yes,
another train.
right.
Sometimes you'd be standing up part way until you could get a seat,
Right.
and did that a couple times.
Well, I should say,
And one time, we decided, well, maybe we can get over there quicker, so we went up to the nearest air base. He said, well, we've got a plane going to San Francisco. Well, we'll take it, at least we'll get out of Oregon. And
uh-huh.
got to San Francisco, and, well, C-47, we got one going to Albuquerque. Okay, we took that. And nothing going out tonight, and we stayed over and went out next morning. Well, we got a B-17 we're delivering, going east. How
Wow.
far is it going? Well, it's going to Topeka, Kansas. We'll take it. So I got to ride in a B-17.
How about that? Almost like hitchhiking.
Well, it was.
Yeah.
If you had a uniform on and they
Sure.
were on your way and they had space for you, they'd give you a ride.
Absolutely.
You'd show up at the mess hall and they'd feed you.
What a great experience,
So, great experience.
I should say. Well, now, your parents and your sisters were,
They were back in Connecticut,
Back in
right?
Connecticut.
Yeah, I had 2 sisters, so I didn't have anybody else in the service.
right, right. So your mother was a Blue Star mother. Fortunately, not a,
Yes.
fortunately not a Gold Star mother.
Right, right.
Well, now let's see. August of '46, you were leaving the Philippines.
40, yeah,
Or
March
45.
March of '46.
March of '46.
Went back to Connecticut, and, let's see, '46, finished my 2 years. And one of the big things that anybody in World War II remembers is you got a college education out of it.
GI Bill.
And I had 2 more years eligibility. I went on and got a degree at Michigan,
Oh, you did, at Ann Arbor.
at Ann Arbor, right?
Wow.
Right.
Well, that was a great experience too,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
Then I got a job with Westinghouse in Pennsylvania where I met Marilyn
How fortunate was that?
52 years ago.
How about that? Oh, that's just great. Well, so you were on the campus there in Ann Arbor for
Yeah, a couple of years,
a
right.
couple of years,
Right.
and you graduated with a class of what? 40?
51.
Oh, 51.
Business. I got a business degree there.
Oh, you did.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, then with the combination of business education and your engineering education and experience, you had a pretty good combination there for
Well, that
getting
got,
a job.
that got me into Westinghouse.
That's great. And now Westinghouse that was in Syracuse?
No, it was in Sharon, Pennsylvania, right on the
Sharon.
Ohio border.
Sure. Oh, yeah,
Right,
near Pittsburgh.
right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, GE is at Syracuse.
Syracuse, right.
Yeah. Well, what did you do at Westinghouse?
Well, this is only an hour programming.
Well, we're doing okay. How much time do we have?
Right now it's 17 minutes.
17 minutes. Oh, that's a lot of time.
I'll try to condense it.
Well, it's fascinating.
The plant at Sharon, Pennsylvania made transformers. Anything from something you could hold in your hand and something that's outside of the pole outside of your
Yeah.
house to the huge power transformers.
Right.
They were the big Westinghouse transformer plant. You know that's all gone. Westinghouse was pretty much broken up about 40 years ago,
Wow.
which brings me to Firestone.
Aha. Where the rubber hits the road, huh?
Not really to Firestone, first to Cyberling Tire,
Oh, yeah.
which was also on its last legs, but Firestone bought them out. And I So I worked for Sarveling until they were being closed down, and they sent me to Dayton Tire,
Mhm.
where in less than a year they were closing.
Wow.
They sent me back to Akron, where I finished my working career. So I've had a rather checkered
Well, I should say,
work experience as well as wartime. So
right.
I have lived and traveled many, many different places
Well, you certainly have.
over the years.
And you know, that brings up a good point, and that is that as bad as war is, and there's no question about that, we don't want wars, we don't want to have to kill people, but it certainly gives people gave people like you and I an opportunity to travel and see other parts of the country. Not only other parts of the world, but of this country itself, which is so great and so beautiful and so vast and so many things to see. Now, you mentioned flying from California to Albuquerque, but your stop there was just an overnight stop?
Well, that's as far as that plane was going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then you got the next plane to go to
Go to-
Kansas.
I think it was Kansas. That's as far as we could hitchhike, and then we took the train the rest of the way. But
Oh, I see, okay, okay. And was that when you were going home to
going home on Christmas furlough, right?
Christmas furlough, 1945,
Right.
44, 45? Well, that was interesting because when you were there in the Philippines in early 45, of course, then the great Battle of Okinawa, which was April of 1945.
Yeah, that was before we got there, right?
Well,
But
that was before you got there.
I read about that, and
Yeah, that was
it's
terrible.
just hard to believe. As bad as the present war is in Iraq, we've lost 3,000 people.
Yeah,
In Okinawa, they lost 3,000 people in a week.
oh, yes, oh, yes.
I think I'm right,
I-
but I know that they
You are
lost.
right. Yeah, and that's what it's difficult for people today
Right.
who didn't experience that to understand. And you know, on that little godforsaken rock called Iwo Jima, they lost over 6,000 Marines in that one battle. Well, the battle lasted a little bit longer than they expected, but yeah, people don't understand that, and of course, it's terrible. It's sad that anybody has to be killed, but by comparison, you know, it just doesn't stack up numbers to numbers.
They just wouldn't quit.
No.
The Japanese just wouldn't quit.
No, they just wouldn't. And you know, we were so fortunate that Harry Truman, the buck stops here, old Harry, he said, this is it, we're going to do it. And I bless him every day of my life that he
Yeah,
gave
right.
it.
Bad as it was, it not only probably saved 500,000 American troops, probably more Japanese civilians. It probably would have been
Millions of them,
1 million of Japanese civilians,
that's right.
because they would not quit.
They were dug in.
They would just fight to the last person.
And you know, as you probably read, when our occupational forces went into Japan, you know, and they found underground,
Yeah.
they were still making aircraft underground,
Yeah.
and our people didn't realize that, you know, and that's something that younger people today don't have an understanding of and don't have a feeling for. Did you ever get to see MacArthur?
Never got to see him. He never had it. Well, he was gone in like 3 weeks after we got there.
Right,
You know,
Right.
went by his headquarters. I've read a lot about it.
of course.
MacArthur is people who maybe haven't read about it. He was kind of how shall I put it, to the Filipinos, he was almost a god.
Yes. Yes.
And he had left the United States Army and became the Marshal of the Philippine Armed Forces. And it was only when the Japanese started threatening their expansion that the United States Army brought him back and made him a general of the U.S. Army again, but still in the Philippines. So
Right.
he had, in the Manila Hotel right on the bay, he had a palatial suite on the top floor of the Manila Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
Incidentally, my son was over in Manila here a few years ago and stopped by the Manila Hotel to see what it was like and brought me back a book. But
How about that?
MacArthur had the top floor of the Manila Hotel. And so when they retook Manila, MacArthur, who took chances sometimes that he shouldn't, he took a company of people himself and fought the Japanese up the stairs in the Manila Hotel
I didn't know that.
until he got to the top and got to his old headquarters. Yeah, they were shooting Japanese, and here's General MacArthur,
In the building.
general of the whole Pacific Armed Forces. Well, he was kind of a crazy guy then.
Well, he was.
Yeah.
He was.
And he set up his headquarters there.
Yeah, it's just amazing.
Back 3 years later, he said, "I shall return," and he
Yep.
sure did.
He sure did. He sure did. Well, he was very controversial, amazing, brilliant, half crazy, all those things. And of course, one of the ironies of the war was that, of course, he was a favorite of FDR,
Right.
as was Chester Nimitz, Admiral
Yeah.
Nimitz. But they divided that command in the
Yeah.
Pacific,
Mhm.
which might not have been one of the most brilliant things that FDR ever did.
Mhm.
But there were those two powerful characters, personalities that had to have their way, so to speak. Well, Ed, when you went back to college and got your degree, and then on to Michigan. So did you get your bachelor's at Michigan or your bachelor's
I got
at
a
Connecticut?
Bachelor's at Connecticut, and I got a master's in business at Michigan.
Ah, so you got your MBA
Yeah,
at
right.
Michigan. Oh, that's marvelous. Well, I'm sure that you're probably a Wolverine fan, aren't you?
Well, I kind of mix loyalties now that
Yeah.
I'm here. You know, my grandkids, they're all
They're
Ohio
Ohioans.
State fans, so.
Yeah, sure. I know it. It's the same way.
I should mention that when I went back after the war, there were 4 of us rooming together that went into the war. All 4 of us came back. 2 had been in combat, and 2 of us were not in combat. One of them that had been in combat ended up a POW in Germany, and the other guy was flying planes in Europe, bombardier in Europe. We all got back together again.
Wonderful.
We talked about it, but not a lot. That's the funny thing. There wasn't, we're too busy getting on with our lives.
That's right. We're having families and wanting to have our own house and everything, things like that. Well, that was another aspect of life. And as you say, so many fellas just didn't have time to reflect on the war. And a lot of, I found through these interviews, a lot of experiences have been lost, of course, because people didn't talk about them. And some people are more reluctant than others to talk about
I
them.
can understand that.
And I love to be able to draw people out. And you've been a wonderful interviewee. Fascinating experience, and you've spoken so well about it and all. Anything else that comes to mind that you'd like to
No.
talk about?
Maryland, we covered everything. Are
you allowed to name your sisters, give your sisters' names and your children's names?
Sure. Give you,
Give your sisters' names and your children's names for this tape?
you want to name them on
Sure,
the,
you mean
Marge?
Marge and Janet, my two sisters, Marge and Janet.
do they live here?
They're both back in New England.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
And your children's
The
names?
children, your
What they
grandchildren?
do?
You mean here in Cincinnati?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Smuckers, Barb and Doug Smucker,
Okay,
and Jesse and Kyle and Jeremy, our three grandchildren.
wonderful.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
I've had this eye problem that reached the point where I no longer drive, and that was a good incentive to leave after 40 years in near Akron and come down and be near our family.
Have some friendly folks around.
That's why we're here.
I should say, that's so
Marilyn's my
important.
driver. Right.
Well, that's marvelous.
Ed, mention Larry,
Pardon?
mention Larry, who works for the UN.
Oh, yeah, did I mention my son Larry
No.
is in Washington, works for the United Nations.
Oh,
right?
really?
Mm-hmm. Just in refugee work,
Oh, my goodness.
right.
That's so important. Well, Ed, I think our time is drawing to a close here, and it's just been a wonderful experience to be with you, and I'm honored to hear your story, and I know that not only your family will appreciate this, but the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County, and the Library of Congress, where it all started.
Right,
And so you're on record forever now.
okay,
You'll be in the archives, and your family will get a chance
good.
to see these things. And we thank Diane Reif very much, and the
Appreciate it.
Welcome.
Wyoming branch of the Public Library. Thank you. That's it.